when I first heard about Remake Learning Days, the national program, I was on a Zoom call with Greg Baer, and he mentioned during that call that he had a book that was about to come out called When You Wonder You're Learning, and his co-author, Ryan Rydzewski, and he talked a little bit about the book, and I think I ordered it immediately on Amazon, the pre-ordered. And not only did the book meet the expectations that I had, which were quite high from hearing Greg talk, but it far exceeded them.
Look, we have neuroscience to demonstrate to us how, in fact, kids' brains are differently wired than previous generations. So we know there are fundamentally different things happening. We also know some things are timeless and classic about learning. And those relationships and that space and the importance of quiet are as critical now as they've ever been. And part of the challenge for us grown-ups is to make sure that we make those spaces while also responding to, very different neurons.
So as we were talking about how can we continue to foster widespread participation, knowing that the book circle idea was a good way to get small groups of people involved and to keep them motivated about our parents and children thriving, it made sense that this would be a book that we would feature. So I contacted Ryan and Greg to see, if maybe they would be good with that, and they were. So I'm absolutely thrilled to tell you today we have more than 140 book circles already registering their attendees. Yep. I think more than 600 people already registered to be part of the book circles, and this is just the kickoff day. Yesterday and today were the kickoff days. So I have great hopes that those of you who are not currently hosting or participating in a book circle, perhaps by the end of the day you'll think, well, I want to do that. And I hope you will become acolytes in the community, because as long as a group has 6 people involved and they meet at least 4 times between now and the end of January, the Patterson Foundation will provide support for the book circles, either $400 directly to the book circle leader, or if you would prefer a $500 gift to the not-for-profit or school, public school of your choice. So I think that's all my commercialing. And now we get to go to the good part. So we are so thrilled and so honored to have Ryan Rydzewski with us. I have to be honest with you, this will be the 5th presentation that Ryan and I are doing since yesterday morning. But so far we've managed to keep it fresh. So and luckily he's enough of a content expert and a charming individual that we've been having great fun bringing forth. So the book is called When You Wonder You're Learning, and it features many of the enduring lessons of Mr. Fred Rogers. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for coming.
So where did the idea for a book come from?
So first, I just want to say thank you all for being here. The fact that, what did you say, about 600 people are, to hear that as the author of this book is astounding to me, because on day one, when this book came out in 2021, I didn't know what I expected. This is my first book. I had it really built up in my mind on publication day that something was going to happen, right? Nothing happened. There were no reviews, no press coverage, nobody invited us anywhere to talk. I had some friends over. We were going to do this big ceremonious walk up to the closest bookstore to my house and then go out for drinks afterward. We get to the bookstore, they didn't even have it in stock. They're like, what book, what are you talking about? So to sit here and find out all these, 2.5 years later that so many people are now reading it, I can't even express how much that means to me. I'm so, so grateful to the Patterson Foundation and to the fellows who have heard me talk 5 times now. It means the world. And also especially means a lot to me that it's happening here, because, this is my first time in Manatee County specifically. My parents live just down the road in Fort Myers. I've been coming to Southwest Florida my entire life. So it's a part of the world that means a lot to me, and I could not be happier to be here. The only time I could possibly be happier to be here is when I come back in January. And any of you who are from Pittsburgh, you know why I'm so excited to come back. So how did this book come together? I work for a foundation in Pittsburgh called the Grapple Foundation. And Grapple was seeded by the family who started what eventually became Rubbermaid in the 1940s. And they endowed a foundation to support basically this stuff, what you see behind me. Anything that supports kids and schools and museums and even some theaters like this one. However it is that we can help kids and families and communities thrive in the Pittsburgh region, that's our charge. But the trouble with that, the challenge of that, is like we don't always know, what does good summer learning look like? What does school readiness mean? What does quality family engagement actually look like? And so for that, we have to turn to the experts in order to do our jobs responsibly, to do our jobs effectively. And that means talking to scientists, people who know more than anyone else in the world about how human beings learn. It means talking to lifelong educators, talking to parents, talking to community theater actors, whatever it is we could find out to find out what does it mean to thrive in the 21st century. And what we quickly realized as we set out and listened to as many of these people as we could possibly get an audience with was that they were doing a couple of things in common. Most of them were asking questions. They were asking questions like, how do we make sure kids feel safe? How do we make sure that kids feel like they belong to a community that cares about them? How can a community, as Fred Rogers used to say, know that they are loved and capable of loving? What we realize is when you talk to scientists and teachers and artists and all kinds of folks, we like to say they sounded in many ways like scriptwriters in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And we realized maybe there's another story we can tell about Fred Rogers. This was a couple of years ago, and at the time, a new biography of Mr. Rogers had just come out. There was the amazing documentary by Morgan Neville. How many of you have seen Won't You Be My Neighbor? A lot of you. How many of you cried at the end? All of you, yeah, all of us, me too. We had just found out that Tom Hanks was going to play Fred in a movie. There was this Fred Rogers renaissance in our culture. And we realized, well, maybe we can take our sort of unique angle and look at Fred Rogers and his methods. How did Fred do what he did? How did he create these good feelings that so many of us have for him and so many different people from so many different walks of life for so many years in a row? So there's nobody like Fred Rogers, somebody whose appeal crosses every demographic you can imagine. How did Fred do that? That's what we wanted to try to figure out. And we quickly realized that there indeed was more to Mr. Rogers than we thought. We remember him, as you all probably remember him, as the nice guy in the sweater, which he totally was. He was a nice guy in the sweater at his core. But he was also a scientist in a very real way. So in the 1950s, well actually, and even still today, there's a place in Pittsburgh called the Arsenal Family and Children's Center. Wonderful place where they do childcare. But in the 1950s, it was really a research and development center connected to the University of Pittsburgh. And it was at Arsenal where if you could imagine a Mount Rushmore of child development theorists and practitioners of the 20th century, they were all at Arsenal at the same time. How many of you know who Benjamin Spock is? He wrote a book called Baby and Child Care. It came out in 1959. It is still on bestseller lists today. It is the second best-selling book of all time in the United States, second only to what? Does anyone want to guess?
The Bible.
The Bible. Everybody always gets that. How many of you have ever heard the phrase identity crisis? That comes from Erik Erikson, a world-renowned psychologist. He was working at Arsenal. There was folks like Brazelton, I'm sure you know his name. All of these folks were working in the same building, in the same town, at the exact same time, and in walks a young Fred Rogers. This is before he ever created the neighborhood. But he's taking what he's learning from Brazelton and Spock and Erikson and a whole host of others, and he starts to blend it with stories and songs and puppetry, building what eventually became this program that we all know and love, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And so Fred, in a very real way, was a learning scientist. He wouldn't have called himself that. It wasn't a term that was used in his day. But he was a learning scientist, and he was a learning scientist who was decades ahead of his time. And so we thought, can we describe the science of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in a way that's accessible and, more importantly, useful to readers today? And that's what I hope we've achieved with this book.
Well, I think you did, and you're welcome. So you mentioned several of the male learning scientist.
Yep.
But I know that there was also a female learning
Yes.
scientist that not only helped him in his initial years, but as the show developed. Can you
Yeah.
speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so most people don't know the name Dr. Margaret McFarland. And Dr. McFarland, her name should be better known today because she is every bit as influential and important as anyone like Dr. Spock or Eric Erickson. And that's because she worked with Fred every single day. Dr. McFarland was a psychiatrist at the University of Pittsburgh who became Fred's lifelong mentor and dear friend. She was working with all these folks, with all these men. It was the 1950s in the academy, teaching Fred the fundamentals of child development. She worked with Fred when he was a student, and when he went on to create The Neighborhood, she consulted on every single episode up until her death in the 1980s. Fred used to stop production in the middle of taping, which if any of you have ever worked in television, like you can't do that. It's so expensive to just walk off the stage and walk down the street a half mile to Margaret McFarland's office, but that's what Fred would do because he knew Dr. McFarland had the answers. He knew Dr. McFarland could help him give the very best to children. And so when he didn't know something, he would shut it all down and he would go talk to her.
So the mission that Fred Rogers had with the show, certainly maybe not teaching learning science as much as demonstrating learning science. Where did that desire come from? Why television, and why did he choose that medium for his mission?
Yeah, it's an unlikely story. Fred was a part-time Floridian. He went to college in Winter Park at Rollins. He was a music student. He didn't really know what he was going to do with his life at that point. But he went home to Latrobe, which is a little town just east of Pittsburgh. Toward the end of his college career, he went home on spring break. Fred came from wealth, enormous wealth. His father owned a factory that created the bricks that lined steel ovens in the Pittsburgh region, and the steel industry then was really centered in Pittsburgh and quite lively. So the Rogers family was the first family in Latrobe to have a television. It's the first time Fred had ever seen a television. He walked into his parents' living room and there's this strange glowing box, and so excited he walks up to it and he turns it on and he hates it. He hates what he sees. Fred Rogers, this icon of television, was repulsed by television when he first saw it because the first thing he ever saw was people throwing pies in each other's faces. And Fred, as a child, had been mercilessly bullied. And when he saw that, he said he hated to see technology being used to demean other human beings, as he himself had been demeaned so often when he was a kid. But despite that initial dislike, Fred, he realized that, look, this technology is clearly going to be everywhere. And within a decade, he was right. Televisions were in 60% of households, and a decade after that, they were in 90. As you all know, almost everybody has a TV today. And he realized, and predicted correctly again, that it was going to be really attractive to kids. The kids were going to love these screens, as we continue to see today. And so he decided, I'm going to make it my life's work to use television to minister to children. He decided to enroll in the seminary, what later became the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And he told his teachers there about this idea. And nobody had ever done this before. His teachers didn't really know what to do with it. And so finally they gave in and said, Fred, if that's what you want to do with your ministry, fine. But if you're going to be on television talking to kids, you have to know something about how they grow and develop and learn. You have to go study something that has to do with child development. And that's how he ended up at Arsenal, just by luck of timing, working with these amazing people.
Wow. So, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, how many of you watched it when, yes, okay. Or how many of you had children who watched it? So, as we think about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Ryan has already mentioned the sweater. What are the things that kind of pop out in your mind? Yes?
Kindness.
Yeah.
Kindness, yeah. What other things stand out? Yes?
That he was very calming.
Mm-hmm. Very calming, yes. And how many of you think that maybe that happened by chance? I mean, I always did. It never occurred to me that there was a method behind everything. But could you walk us through just the opening moments of the show?
Yeah.
And
So you all can all probably picture this in your mind, right? Fred walks through the television front door, and he waves, and you hear those first piano notes of "Won't You Be My Neighbor," that iconic song. And he takes off his suit, which I think is sort of representative of the fast-paced working world of adults, and he puts on his sweater. And then he changes his shoes from dress shoes to a pair of sneakers. And he sits down, giving off this vibe of calm and comfort and kindness. And there's even, in his living room, if you remember, there's a flashing traffic light, always signaling yellow. Again, another signal to slow down. We know how important it is for kids to feel safe, to feel that they won't be judged, to feel that they can slow down in order to learn. And Fred did that, every single day for almost 30 years. He came and entered almost exactly the same way. So that's sort of one element of the learning science in a show. You'll notice he always comes from left to right, because of course that's how we learn to read. We go from left to right. And I mean, you pick any scene from any episode, from any season of more than 30 seasons of The Neighborhood, and you can pick out the science, the reasoning behind why he's doing what he's doing. So there's a famous scene where he lets an egg timer just count down for a minute. Again, you can't do that on television. Just watch a timer for a full minute. There's a scene when he paints his living room with, how many of you remember Mr. McFeely? Mr. McFeely helps him paint the living room, and then they sit down and they just watch the paint dry. And they're doing this because they know how important it is for kids to get bored once in a while. When we get bored, we go into this. If you've ever gone for a really long walk, or you've been on the highway for a long time, and suddenly you realize, I haven't had a conscious thought for an hour, right? You go into, that's called your default mode. And when you go into your default mode, that's often when we have our most creative ideas. One of my favorite statistics we learned while researching the book was 78% of people have their best ideas in one particular place. And does anyone know what that place might be? The shower. It's the shower. It's one of the last places where we leave our brains alone, where we go into that default mode. Fred was trying to give us opportunities to do that in The Neighborhood. And I'll give you just one more example. So the title of the book, When You Wonder, You're Learning, comes from a song of Fred's called Did You Know? Some of you might remember it. It's a song about the importance of questions and about wondering, encouraging kids to be curious. And what we've since learned is that when you wonder, you're learning. That's a lyric from the song. That is true in a very literal way. There's a study done at the University of California at Davis that found that when kids are curious, that when anybody's curious, something happens in your brain. It switches on. They said it's becomes like a vortex that sucks in whatever it is that you're motivated to learn, whatever it is that you're curious about, but then also everything around you. You start taking in information even when you don't know it. So in a very real sense, when you wonder, you're learning. And again, what's amazing is that study came out in 2014. Fred had been dead for over a decade. Fred wrote Did You Know in 1979, decades before this study came out. He was that far ahead of his time. And he knew, just staying on the theme of curiosity, how important curiosity can be. He knew, he was always trying to tell kids that it's okay to wonder. And he was always trying to show them what is out there to wonder about. You can remember all the places that Fred took us and the people he introduced us to and the guest stars he brought in. He was trying to show kids what's out there to wonder about because he knows it's hard to be curious about things that are totally unfamiliar. This is true for kids, and it's also true for adults, as we've discovered over the past few months. So I'm going to give you all a name, and I want you to tell me on a scale of 1 to 5 how much curiosity that name stirs in you, okay? How excited do you get to learn more about this name when I tell you, okay? 1 being the least curious. Ryan, thanks for flying all the way down here, 1,000 miles, but come on. 5 being, you should really move to Bradenton because I need to hear more about Mr. Rogers. All right, the name is Angus the monkey. Anybody? 1 to 5. 2, thank you for your honesty, Bill. I see some 1s. All right, thank you. That's okay. Now, we're not familiar with Angus the monkey, so we don't really care about Angus the monkey. But I'm going to give you a little bit more information about Angus the monkey. Because in 2002, Angus, I should tell you, was a soccer mascot. In 2002, Angus the monkey was elected mayor of a small town in England. Where are we with curiosity? 1 to 5. I see some fives, all right, you're still at a 4. I have a holdout, all right. So Angus the monkey actually served the term as mayor. And then Angus the monkey was re-elected 2 more times. Where are you with curiosity? 5s, thank you. So if I were your teacher or your parent or your grandparent or your mentor, I could use that curiosity to open up a discussion about voting or elections or really whatever I want. And so if you remember Fred taking us to the crayon factory, for example, taking us someplace new, he didn't just drop us into the factory. He started with something kids were already familiar with. He started with a box of crayons or even a single crayon. That's the kind of learning science that Fred used again and again. And even if it sometimes looks strange to adults, and trust me, it does look strange to adults if you go back to and watch The Neighborhood today. But once you start to understand the learning science behind what he was doing, you realize suddenly, not only does it make sense, you realize what a genius Fred really was.
So in talking about curiosity and creativity, in reading your book, you included, different studies with information. I was really struck by the study that showed children are very creative.
Yeah.
And then as we get older, I don't know whether society beats that out of us, or I don't know, but that it diminished over time. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So the study you're referring to was done by a guy named George Land, and this is 1968, the same year that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood goes national, and he's hired by NASA to develop a test for creativity. The space agency was a really big deal, as you might know, in the late 1960s. And they needed to find astronauts who could solve the problems, creatively solve the problems that would inevitably come up in space. And so George Land creates this test of creativity for NASA. But then he gives this test to a group of 1,000 5-year-old kids, just to see what would happen. And what he found was that 98% of those kids scored so highly that by NASA standards, these kids were creative geniuses. Kids are naturally creative. They come to us creative. Now, George Land also discovered something else. He followed that same cohort of 5-year-olds. And when those 5-year-olds turned 10, the share of creative geniuses fell from 98% to 30%. When those kids turned 15, it fell from 30% to 12%. By the time these kids had grown up, the share of geniuses fell from 98% to 2%, which is a total reversal. And what Land and his team concluded isn't that creativity naturally fades with age. Like, we're not doomed to become less creative just because we're getting older. They realized that non-creative behavior is something that we learn. So as we become more self-conscious, as we become a little bit more worried about what our peers think about us, as we worry about being rejected from our neighborhoods, whatever those neighborhoods, wherever they happen to be, we learn to become less creative, less innovative, less open to new ideas. You only need to go to one school board meeting to get a sense of what this looks like in practice among adults. We actually realized that there are comedy clubs in the United States in which the front row is discounted because people are terrified of having to become part of the show, which, by the way, but that's why Fred, he was always bringing us creative guest stars. Do you remember the people we got to meet in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? So Yo-Yo Ma and Wynton Marsalis and Julia Child. Fred didn't do that because he thought everybody who saw Wynton Marsalis play the trumpet would want to go play the trumpet themselves, or that everybody who saw Julia cook would want to go be a chef. He did it to show kids that we don't have to give up the creative pursuits that enrich our lives as we get older. He showed kids that creativity isn't just for kids. He used to say that the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she does and just loves it in front of you. And every single day, Fred was surrounding us with adults who truly love whatever it is that they happen to love.
It's remarkable when you go back and you look at the episodes and you see all of those things. Do you remember Officer Clemens? That was the first time I ever heard opera, I think.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Everybody had their own creative endeavor on the side. So Officer Clemens was the neighborhood police officer, but he was also the neighborhood opera singer. Handyman Negri was the sort of fix-it guy, but he was also the neighborhood guitarist. They all had these things that enriched their lives, and they loved whatever it is that they did in front of kids.
That's really... So we know that in Mr. Rogers' home, or the set that was his home. We met this one Fred Rogers, but then we got to take the trolley and we went to the land of make-believe, and we met all of these other characters who were not all kind and slow, and they really ran the gamut. Can you speak to some of the land of make-believe folks?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier that Fred was bullied as a child, and Fred spent a lot of time alone because of that. He also spent a lot of time alone because the air quality in Pittsburgh at the time was abysmal because of all the steel making, and he was horribly asthmatic, and he was just isolated from his peers. And so he often turned to the arts. He was in his room all the time. He would play piano and he would write songs, and he had some puppets, and he started to develop these characters, which would eventually resurface many years later as King Friday, the sort of domineering king who's really arrogant, but he's only arrogant because he's trying to mask his own insecurities. Daniel Tiger, who is this timid tiger, and of course has been spun off into this delightful animated program. X the Owl, who's the sort of awkward teenager, and Lady Fairchild, who's a little bit of a prankster. In many ways, all of these characters were stand-ins for Fred's emotions, and honestly, Fred's emotions are all of our emotions. They're human emotions. We all know what it's like to be alone, or to be shy, or to sort of have to fake it like like King Friday. And Fred was raised in a household where, he had a very loving family. He always talked about how wonderful his parents and grandparents were. But I think, as was sort of the style at the time, it was not a household where you expressed your emotions, especially if those emotions were negative. When Fred was bullied, he'd be told, just don't let it get you. If you care, the more you care, the more they're going to do it. So just ignore it. But Fred couldn't ignore it, and most of us can't ignore it when it happens to us. And so in many ways, that neighborhood of make-believe was Fred's way of expressing what was going on inside himself. And of course it's relatable because these are human emotions, and kids have these big feelings too. But when you watch these characters on screen working themselves out, and they don't always work out nicely. Sometimes there's conflict, there's sadness, there's loneliness in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood too. But when you watch it on screen, it's fictionalized and it's safe. And when things are fictionalized and safe, we're not judged for them. And when we're not judged for them, we can talk about them. And Fred used to say that anything that's mentionable becomes more manageable. And I think the neighborhood of make-believe was his way of helping kids and adults, to some extent, make those big feelings, even if they're confusing or painful, make those feelings more mentionable.
Yeah, and I think, you said adults in some respects, but I shared with you yesterday, I did not watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood when I was a child. The home I grew up in, we didn't have the special TV antenna to get PBS. So I was unfamiliar with it until I was studying to be a teacher. And so in college, we were given an assignment to watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and I think we had to write a report about it or something, but it was, and at the time, I was having a very difficult time at college. My mom had passed away that year. My dad, in the throes of his grief, had started dating the neighbor who lived down the street 4 weeks after my mom died, which, yes, that's exactly the reaction I had, like, what? What is that? So there was a lot going on, and I didn't know how to process any of it, and turned on Mr. Rogers to watch it for this homework assignment, and he was talking about what do you do with the mad that you feel inside. And I felt, kind of that out-of-body experience, like, this man is talking directly to me and helping me. And I don't know whether it was truly part of the episode, but I also feel that, also heard that, you're okay just the way you are, and it's okay to have these mad feelings. And I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed, and then of course felt ridiculous for that being, what I experienced. But I do think that his messages, although we think of television for children, I think he raised a whole generation of parents and educators to treat children with a respect and those.
Yeah, he was criticized a lot because people mistake that sentiment, I like you just the way you are, for being synonymous with saying everything you do is perfect or everything you think is okay. That's not what Fred was saying. What Fred was saying was, when he said, I like you just the way you are, is, for all of your flaws, there is nothing you could do that would ever exclude you from the neighborhood that we all share. I will never treat you as less than because of what you look like or where you come from or who you love. I will never reject your humanity. And I think that that's a much deeper and much more complex sentiment than, you're perfect, everything you do is great. And we actually have science now that shows when kids know that they are accepted, when kids know that they are accepted exactly as they are, even if they're having negative feelings, even if their behavior isn't optimal. And when I say accepted, again, I don't mean celebrated, I just mean accepted. Those kids become much more likely to thrive on just about every indicator we can imagine.
So in the land
Kids
of
and adults.
Kids and adults. In the land of make-believe, King Friday was one of my favorite characters. I loved how blustery he was and his decrees and him, if he got uncomfortable, he would ban things. Just ban things. And as we were, yes, that's what I thought too. So as we were preparing for the book circles, and I was, making sure I read the book again so that we were ready for Ryan to come and all of that, and the whole thing of, King Friday, like, this makes me uncomfortable, I'm going to ban it. And I just thought, we need to go and do book circles in Tallahassee and just, have a little moment to talk about King Friday and how that worked out for him. He actually banned curiosity.
Curiosity. He built a border wall in the very first episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah. So again, ahead of his time, Fred Rogers. So I have many more questions for Ryan, but we also have so many wonderful folks and people with lots of experience. I want to give you an opportunity to ask your questions of Ryan. So any thoughts or observations that you would like to share? Yes. Oh.
I have a learning disability, and when I watched your show, I felt like I didn't feel like I was slow or not picking up quickly. What was it that I could absorb and I could understand? What was he doing that made it so comfortable for me?
I mean, I think the slowness is part of it. And we think of Fred as talking slowly, and he did talk slowly, and he did leave space, like with the egg timer. But there have actually been some studies that study the number of cuts. So how often do we switch from one shot to another? Fred never allowed more than 2 cuts per second, or 2 cuts per minute. So you at least had a camera shot that lasted 30 seconds, often longer. The average children's show today, you have a cut every 1 second or every 2 seconds versus every 30 seconds. So in a very real way, it is slower. And I'm sorry, is your Christine, right? So Hedda Sherapin. Hedda is a master educator in her own right. She worked with Fred from the very first day of production back in the late 1960s. And she explained to us that Fred used to struggle with, if you ask a question in the neighborhood, he often leaves space for a response. And in some ways, he struggled with that because he was always trying to be honest with children, and he didn't want to give the impression that he was listening to them through the TV, that he could hear what they were saying, right? But there is something to be said for not expecting kids to have an answer to everything right away, not expecting adults to have an answer for everything right away. He leaves space for thought, he leaves space for reflection. these sorts of activities and emotions that we don't typically associate with television, especially children's television today.
That's super helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
And I loved how you check back in after you ask a question, you nod to you and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so he was always encouraging in his little ways.
I was going to say another thing he did in a lot of his shows is he was not afraid to show his vulnerability.
Yeah.
Or like he would make mistakes. And I remember there was one famous cut where he was, I think, was it Etta Jenks? I don't know, she was doing a little dance and he was trying to follow along and he messed up. You know, he couldn't do the steps, but he didn't cut it out.
Exactly.
He could see, you know, we make mistakes, or he'd be with an artist and he'd just, you know, his didn't look as good, but he was not afraid to just try.
There's a very famous, well, it's unfortunately been immortalized on the internet, scene of Fred from a very early episode. And he's sitting around a table with a bunch of kids and he's singing "Where is Thumbkin?" and they're doing these sort of complicated hand movements. And Fred starts, he can't quite keep up. And eventually, this song involves like the middle fingers, and he eventually holds them both up. And now you can see this on the internet. And he left that in. He left it in a children's television program. He could have just done another take. But I think that says something about how Fred approached learning and how Fred approached life, right? We know now the power of what's been called a growth mindset. Right, when kids understand that it's okay to make mistakes, as long as we use those mistakes as opportunities to get better. And there's all sorts of studies that show that this can be really powerful for kids under the right circumstances. There are, free online tools that teach kids that lesson in 30 minutes. And that 30 minutes, kids can, in some cases, come out more likely to enroll in advanced math courses. It raises grades, it raises attendance, it raises graduation rates. But, and this is really important, growth mindset, the understanding that we can improve through effort, only works, it only has those effects if the adults around kids have that same mindset. That is, if adults actually believe that kids are capable of learning and growing, and when adults convey that belief in ways that kids find authentic and trustworthy and real.
First of all, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
For bringing this book into existence. I'm feeling so incredibly happy by being here.
Oh, thank you.
Experience.
That makes me happy.
I definitely want to facilitate a circle with adults. As we've established, this is also entirely applicable to our lives as grown-ups.
Yeah.
So any suggestions for how I can facilitate a deepening connection to this philosophy?
That's a great question. So first of all, Beth can help you with logistics for sure in terms of, she asked me earlier, like, what do you hope adults get out of this? Especially if adults maybe aren't parents or teachers themselves, and that's totally okay. And I'll say a couple of things to that. One is if you go to the Fred Rogers archive in Latrobe, which is this totally unremarkable, it's an office. There's just cabinets and boxes everywhere. But in those boxes are decades worth of correspondence from kids and from parents and from teachers, all of whom some of them, the adults are asking for advice, and the kids are sharing things that will just shatter your heart, right? Mr. Rogers, I'm sick, or my parents are splitting up, my dog died. And if any of you have ever written a letter to Mr. Rogers, you can probably go find it. They kept everything. And Fred answered everything. He answered upwards of 50 to 100 letters a day at the height of his popularity. And you can read in the margins of these letters, his thoughts, how he's thinking about responding. And you can draw a direct line in many cases from those letters to something he's then talking about in the neighborhood. It was very much a conversation, just as these book circles would be a conversation. Even though television is a one-way medium, Fred was always listening. But a not insignificant share of those letters are from folks who are in nursing homes, folks who aren't parents or teachers themselves, folks who tell Fred, I'm alone in the world. And I just want to thank you for being a presence in my life. So I hope that to a degree that these book circles, they're for everybody, just like the neighborhood was for everybody. They're a chance to be part of something. And again, I hate to sound like a broken record. We know from science how important it is for adults too to be part of something. Positive relationships help us live longer. People who have positive relationships and tend to have higher incomes. Just the amount of benefits you get from having a community, from having a neighborhood is astounding. And these are opportunities to form those little neighborhoods. I'll just share one quick study. It's my favorite study from the book. I talked about this one this morning. that I think underscores the importance of having a community. So a couple of years ago, there was a group of researchers who gave college students a fake personality test. Kids didn't know it was fake, but then the scientists divided the students into 3 groups based on their supposed results. So they told group 1 that, hey, based on your personality, according to this test, you're going to have loving, caring relationships for the rest of your days. Your spouse is going to adore you. Your kids are going to think you're the best. You're going to get promotions at work because your boss thinks you're amazing. You're going to have great neighbors and great friends. Life is going to be beautiful for you. They told group 2, this is group 2 here, not as good for you all, group 2. Now, you might get married, but your spouse is eventually going to resent you. Your kids aren't going to speak to you. Your friends are going to abandon you. Your career is going to plummet, and you're going to spend and end your life alone. That's just according to the test that we gave you. I don't know why this is. They told group 3, sorry, group 3, based on the results of your test, look, life is going to be rough. Because you are accident-prone people. You're going to spend your life getting in car accidents. You're going to fall down the stairs. You're going to be physically ill. You're going to spend most of your life in a hospital bed. I mean, good luck to you. I don't know why. And can you imagine how cruel this is? And so then they gave every student a timed IQ test. Now, which group do you think did the worst on this test? 1, 2, or 3? Everybody says 3, and everybody's wrong.
Oh.
Group 3 did just as good as group number 1. And so what the researchers realized that it wasn't bad news in general that was causing a drop in test scores. It was the prospect, group 2, of social exclusion. When you based on your personality test, because of who you are, thought the people I love most in my life are going to abandon me, and I'm going to be excluded from my community, and I'm going to be alone. They really believed that again, and they lost the ability to think, and they lost the ability to reason clearly. They lost the ability to learn. We know on an instinctive, almost evolutionary level how scary that is. I'm reading a book right now that's an amazing book called They Thought They Were Free. Has anyone read this book? It's a Jewish journalist who goes to Germany in the wake of World War II and interviews everyday people who had joined the Nazi Party, just trying to understand how normal everyday people could get swept up in such a thing. And to a person, what all of them say is this was an opportunity to be part of something. We will go looking for belonging in really dark places if we aren't given it, if we don't have opportunities to do it in positive ways in our lives. And many of you probably know the sort of bowling alone, I forget the guy's name, Robert.
Roger Moore.
Yeah. But so there are fewer and fewer opportunities in American life to be part of something, to be part of a neighborhood. And I hope that this is a really long way of answering your question. I hope that these are opportunities to rebuild neighborhoods wherever we happen to be.
Yeah. And from the logistics side of it, we have provided a discussion guide for all the book circle leaders. The discussion guide is designed so if you are busy living your life and you don't have the time to sit down and think what are we going to talk about tonight in the book circle or whatever, you can go right to that discussion guide. There are questions there with some of the quotes pulled from the book. And for those of you with young children, we've also included an activity for children so that if the adults want to be in one part of the house talking about the book and the children are in another part of the house, there are activities that they can do that match up with what the topic is for that particular session. So with Fred Rogers, you mentioned something the other day, and the question from Robert, is it? Yes, the question made me think of it. When you talked about listening deeply, and then I know there was another part of that.
Speaking lovingly.
Speaking lovingly. So that all of us in our book circles, there's bound to be people who have opinions or theories or memories that are going to be different than your own life experiences. But to give people the space where they can talk about what their experiences are, and for the even if the reaction from you is I can't relate to that, my life is different, but to accept that that's what their experience has been, and to give people that space to be able to talk and to share. We don't have to have the answers as much as we have to grapple with each other for what the questions are, right?
And I just was curious, you guys are co-authors, how that process works. Because as I'm reading the book, I'm like, I don't know who wrote this or
Sure.
all that.
And I'm happy to hear you say that. Greg checks my worst impulses. I've joked that this book would be 700 pages long if it were just me. He was always pushing both of us to keep the exhausted parent in mind. He kept using that phrase, the exhausted parent. I didn't know what it meant. I wasn't a parent at the time. Now I'm an exhausted parent. And I'm very glad that Greg, we tried to keep it to what is essential. As far as like what the actual process looked like, it was a lot of bouncing ideas off one another. It was a lot of, we write about this concept in the book called psychological safety. And psychological safety has been found to be like the number one thing that powers effective teams. If you have a company that functions at a really high level or a team within a company, almost always you'll find that this team has what researchers now dub psychological safety. And psychological safety is trust, but it's more than that. It is the sense that you can speak up and disagree with the other person or with the other people on your team without fear of being rejected or ostracized or attacked, or in my case, fired, because Greg is technically my boss. And we had that, right? Like we trusted each other that we wanted to do what was best for the book and what was best for what we hope was best for readers and what was best for one another. So we still like each other. We've gone through this for many years now, and we only had one major disagreement throughout this whole process, from idea to publication to promotion. And that one disagreement was over, the publisher sent us 5 possible narrators for the book, 5 audio clips, and we disagreed over who was best. And I won the argument.
I do want to let you know that we are getting ready to launch Suncoast Remake Learning Days 2024 very soon. We're going to have a kickoff event at Suncoast Technical College, the Sarasota campus, on October 28th from 9 to 12. It's going to be hands-on learning. Soren 4 is going to be there, yay Soren 4, and many other community partners. Moat Marine is coming, the Oslo Rep is coming, Florida Studio Theater, Sidewalk Science, and they have new sun filters for their telescopes so you can actually look at heavenly bodies in the daylight. Which, yes, so it's going to be really fun, open to the general public, families to come. But while we are having that wonderful pop-up party, we're also going to have information on how folks can participate in Suncoast Remake Learning Days 2024, what the support package from the Patterson Foundation looks like, and opportunities for potential partners to meet each other and to share, their dreams and aspirations for what the various events could be. I have no idea how many events we're going to have this year. Expanding to 15 days kind of changes it a little bit. I imagine it's going to be more than last year, and I'm hoping that all of you will participate in some way in the joy of that festival. But before you go, I do want to say that although, as we talk about Fred Rogers, it's very easy to think of him as being a superhuman being, he was a man, a regular man, and Ryan, you write about Joanne, his wife, saying that he wasn't a saint, even though he seems like maybe he was a little bit. I have a very vivid memory of Fred Rogers at the Emmy Awards, and if you think about the Emmy Awards, and it's all the superstar people in their superstar outfits, and the red carpet and everybody being cooler than cool, and then there was Fred Rogers, and a little different than that thing, but he had a time on the stage, and he completely changed the atmosphere of the room. And would you talk a little bit about how he did that and why he did that?
Atmosphere was something that was actually really important to Fred. Somebody once asked him, describe the neighborhood to me. What what are you trying to do? And he didn't call it a television program when he responded. He said, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is an atmosphere. It's an atmosphere that allows people to feel comfortable enough to be who they really are. And again, going back to that sense of, I like you just the way you are. Fred was trying to get us comfortable enough to be our authentic selves. And he had this little exercise that he did in order to create that atmosphere, just as his neighborhood created that atmosphere for more than 30 years. And I'll do that exercise in a second. But first, I just want to say, I mentioned earlier that quote from Fred, the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she does and loves it in front of you. And I have to say, the other night, I met the SOAR and 4 people, and I don't know if I've ever met anybody who loves their work more than they do. You all are so lucky to have them here. They do amazing work, amazing work. Okay, so Fred used to do this little exercise when he gave speeches, and he did it on stage at the Emmys, and he would do it when he gave commencements, and I think that this sums up everything Fred did. It sums up everything Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was about. So I'll just recite it to you, word for word. From the time you were very little, you've had people who have smiled you into smiling, people who've talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. Some of them may be here right now. Some may be far away. Some may even be in heaven. But wherever they are, if they've loved you and encouraged you and wanted what was best in life for you, then they're right inside yourself. And I feel that you deserve some quiet time on this special occasion to devote some thought to them. So let's just take a minute in honor of all the people who've cared about us all along the way. And as Fred used to say, 1 silent minute. I'll watch the time.
I want to thank you all for taking the time to remember those people. I know, I think that I agree with you, but it's such a beautiful way to remember who we are as authentic human beings and how we can take our true selves into the world and love other people into loving. And I want to thank you all for what you already do for that to happen, and your willingness to share your time and your intentions with us today. I want to thank Alexa and Avery and Kelly once again for setting us up today and doing such a great job with that. If you have any questions at all about the book circle, I'm here to help answer them. Avery has been amazing in getting all of the book circles registered thus far. We can help you. If you were unable to pick up your books today because maybe you don't have enough people registered in your circle yet, do not worry. We are not going to let you go without books. So we will make sure that we're able to get you the books when you are ready for them. And as I mentioned, Ryan will be available to sign books for those of you who already have them. And thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being who you are.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. All right, well done.